ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Dinozor Gaming, where we learn to be a better player. Today we're going to be talking about aspect, identity, and Star Wars Unlimited. Essentially everything about each aspect. What do they do? What makes them tick? What are your win conditions with that aspect? And we will be doing a deep dive in a future video about aspect pairings. For example, if you're playing aggression and command together, what should you be doing different? But today it's mostly going to be focusing on each aspect individually. This is very important during deck building, of course, to know what color to pair with what leader, or maybe what color combination really fits your personal playstyle. But it's also very important to know during the gameplay itself, because if you're trying to do something that your aspect does not excel at, if you're trying to play to your aspect's weaknesses instead, you're not going to have a great time. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at them here one by one. The first one, of course, going to be vigilance. In general, if you want to know a very, very short summary of what each aspect does, you can take a look at the dual colored cards that they have. For example, vigilance pictured above here, and it'll give you 4-sentence description of what they do. But to be more precise here, some of the main keywords you're going to be seeing a lot in vigilance are going to be grit, because you have a lot of high health units, so you want them to hit harder when they're damaged. You have restore, that's going to constantly heal up your base when your units attack. You have shielded, that's going to make your units last longer, and sentinel to protect your other units or your base from further damage. So as you can see, it's a very defensive aspect at its core. What vigilance does extremely well. We're not going to deep dive into the cards. Feel free to pause the video if you want to take a look at it. But essentially, durability and shields here. Cards that will be either very hard to attack into, or cards that can circumvent some removals. Just ways to make your units stick in place. Next up, we have healing. Very good at healing, whether we're talking about your base or your other units, or a mix of both. For example, in Redemption, Vigilance has the best access to healing completely in the game. We have efficiency, cards that are really good to do a 2-for-1. For those who are not aware, 2-for-1 essentially means trading 2 of your cards for 1 of your opponents. So things like Avenger that will come in, kill something, and then your opponent needs to spend a card to kill it. So now you're up a card, and you're eventually going to wear them down that way. There is also a ton of removal. This is the aspect for removal. If you see something on your opponent's board and you no longer want to see it, Vigilance is absolutely the color for you. We have removal in every single flavor. If you can think of a way to kill a card, Vigilance does it. And like a very minor sub-theme in Vigilance is going to be card draw, but less about direct draw, more about replacing units. You'll have a lot of units that will, when defeated, draw a card. So it's a minor way to keep your hand full. And what are some of the things that Vigilance doesn't do well? Well, Vigilance is very weak early. So a lot of the units, especially the ones that trade efficiently, 2-for-1, are not cheap. They usually cost anywhere upwards of 7, 8, 9. So in general, your early game is going to be very struggling. You don't have access to ramp in this color, and you don't have a lot of good units that can trade early, but you do have the restore to help you get to the late game. You have very low damage output. What that means is that if your opponent is stabilizing the board and you're trying to kill them, you're gonna have a bad time. You usually don't have the burst necessary to get through that last few points of damage. Quite a bit of difficulty dealing with wide boards. There's not much in terms of multi-targeted removal. Of course, there's the big ones like Super Laser Blast that will clear out an entire board, but at a low cost, you don't have many options. So if your opponent is able to stick 2-3 units early on, it's going to be very hard for you to deal with it. And finally, trouble finishing off low health units. Most of the removal in this game is very good at dealing with individual cards. As we saw earlier with Fell the Dragon, for example, gets rid of a card for 4. That's great if your opponent has a full health 7-cost unit in play. But if your opponent has a 3-cost that has already attacked and now only has 1 health left, well, you're usually going to struggle to deal with that, and you'll often enough rely on your secondary aspect for that. Their win condition as Vigilance in general is going to be outlasting and outvaluing your opponent. And what we mean by that is it is very rare for you to win a game as Vigilance by dealing damage to your opponent's base. Of course, this is going to change based on what your second aspect is, because in some ways you can bend an aspect to doing what you want it to do, or focus on a secondary aspect more. But in general, you will be winning by attrition, by making it so your board state is just too big for your opponent to deal with, or you've ran your opponent out of cards and they just cannot play anymore. That's essentially what Vigilance wants to do. It wants to control and maintain. Next up, we have aggression, being the complete opposite of vigilance here, in being the most aggressive color in theory. Some of the keywords you're expected to see here are going to be raid, essentially giving you more attack when you're attacking. Saboteur, that lets you bypass those sentinels and those shields. Overwhelm, which will let you deal damage to the base even while you're killing their units. So far, very aggressive, of course. Hidden, making it so your units cannot be attacked as soon as they're played, giving them a bit of a chance to attack back. Grit, same as vigilance, but a bit more aggressively statted in this situation. And they have a very secondary theme of smuggle. Normally, we're only putting non-set based keywords here, but red aggression does tend to have a lot of powerful smuggle, so it is worth a mention. Now, what does aggression do well? Well, clearly they have a lot of high damage units that are able to deal a ton of damage to your opponent's base through attacking or when played or when your opponent plays a card. Just a lot of ways to put a lot of pressure on your opponent early. They have damage-based removal, essentially ways to deal damage to units. This is some of the most efficient removal outside of vigilance. However, because it is direct damage, it is vulnerable to things like shields and any other protection. They have fast and disposable units. In general, most of the units in aggression are going to be very low statted, but they're there to get in, do their job, and immediately die, right? So whether that's dealing damage to a base or to a unit on defeated or when played, or just having a big statted body that you don't care about losing as long as it's done a little bit of damage. You have a ton of inevitability and reach. And what we mean, this is something we talk about a lot in general. When you're playing an aggressive deck, whether that's aggression or something else, very often the more control-y mid-range decks are going to be able to clear out your board at some point. And if you haven't killed them at that point, you need a way to bypass their defenses, because you're not going to break through if they've stabilized. If they have sentinels in play or just giant units that are going to kill everything you play, you need some way to be inevitable, right? You need reach, you need cards that can deal damage from your hand, whether that's For a Cause, Ruthless Raider, Devastator, cards that can come out and attack like Cassian Andor, or a way to just ready your unit that has already attacked, just dealing damage when your opponent is not expecting it, and red is really, really good at that. Card draw is a pretty major theme. This aspect has the best card draw in the game. No questions asked, Chiari Mundi being the best card, of course, but it's not just about draw. They are also amazing at discard. Essentially, aggression is the color for hand manipulation, whether that's drawing yourself or making your opponent discard. Some of the cards search and fetch for you. Some of them just draw and make your opponent discard. Essentially, if you do not like having low amount of cards in hand, aggression is your color. We spoke about discard, and the last thing is going to be upgrade removal. Upgrades are a very pivotal part of Star Wars Unlimited, and aggression has the most tools to deal with it. There are so many ways to defeat upgrades in this color, making it very, very risky to just blindly put an upgrade on a unit. Now, what does aggression do poorly? Aggression has very, very fragile units, especially early. If your opponent is able to deal a bit of damage left and right early on and get rid of your units, they can really, really break your momentum, and that's dangerous. Aggression generally struggles with shields and durability. As we mentioned, most of their damage is most of their removal is damage based. So if they have a ton of shields, it's very hard to bypass. There are certain cards in the color that let you completely negate that, things like Piercing Shot, but they are so niche and scenario specific that most people will not be playing them. Very few, if not no access whatsoever to healing. So if you fall behind and somehow find yourself to not be the beatdown in the matchup, too late, you're not really going to be able to heal back up. And finally, struggles to maintain board. Fairly obvious, if you're playing the aggressive deck, you're not going to have the better units, you're going to have the faster ones. So if you manage to maintain the board, well, good job, because most of the time your opponent is going to clear out whatever you play as soon as they can. And if you have the board, you're not going to have it for very long in this color. Now, what is the win condition as aggression? Very clearly, it's going to be killing your opponent early. It is not likely for you to outvalue your opponent in this color. You want to be dealing all of the damage as you can to your opponent's base as fast as you can. You're essentially the color that puts a clock on your opponent, and you need to do it before their big boys come in. Next up, we have command. Command being the ramp in big boys. Most card games have this in green, and this is no different this time around. Some of the main keywords in command are going to be ambush, ways to bring in a unit and attack the same way. That is also kind of what a lot of their removal is focused on. They have a very minor focus in restore, but it is mostly on the heroic side. They have a lot of overwhelm, similar to aggression, because they have big units and you don't want to be blocked by a little sentinel. You have sentinels themselves. They have a little bit of defense as well. So it is kind of like a very middle of the pack, right between aggression and vigilance. But the ramp really helps to set it apart. So let's check out what command does really, really well. Well, clearly they have the biggest units in the game, right? At any cost you want, even at 2 costs, we're talking about Gungi being the biggest 2 cost. Obviously, they also have the biggest expensive cards in Supremacy, Reinforcement Walker, Vader, so many other options. In general, if you want big boys, green is going to be your color. They have a ton of ramp or discards, ways to just not necessarily cheat out units, but accelerate your game plan to put bigger things in play before your opponent can. And often enough, that will cause you to win the game. They have very strong conditional damage-based removal. That's a mouthful, I know. Well, but to deep dive a bit more into it, their damage is fairly damage-based. Sorry, their removal is fairly damage-based, kind of like aggression. However, most of the time, while it is stronger than aggression, it is very conditional. And usually you'll be dealing your unit's damage to something. Taking a look at any single one of these cards, one of your units is dealing damage to one or multiple things. And that is, in theory, very, very strong. But if you're behind on the board, if you don't have a unit in play, these cards do nothing. So some of the best removal, but one of the hardest to use. Now, the ability to go tall or wide, it's interesting. We don't have any examples cards here because there's too many. Essentially, command as a color doesn't need to be playing big boys. It can also play a lot of small boys. You could be building a deck that has a ton of tokens in command. You really have the tools to do it either way. There is a very minor side thing of healing. But they also focus heavily on buffs and upgrades. And what we mean by that is cards that will make your units bigger. So you don't only have the biggest units, but you also have ways to make your small units big, whether that's anthem effects like Victor Leader, experience giving effects like Supreme Leader Snoke, or even something like Unity of Purpose that can just buff up your entire board by giving them all an extra 5 health and 5 damage and just end the game right there. And lastly, we have tutoring, something that this color does extremely well that most of the other colors don't. You don't have a lot of card draw, but you do have a lot of ways to search your deck. Things like Vader or Caloran, look at the top 7 or 10 cards of your deck and play something. Prepare for Takeoff and Grand Moff Tarkin do similar things, but they draw you those cards instead. Essentially, it's a very strong effect to be able to look at so many cards and pick what you want. It gives you a layer of consistency in a game that is often forced to have no consistency due to relying on your card draw. Now, what does command do poorly? Command is very, very reliant on ramp. Yes, of course, they have early units, but most of the time you want to be getting to late game as command. You want to be putting your big boys in play. So you will rely a lot on ramp cards like Resupply, Super Laser Technician. And the problem is that if you do not draw those cards early on, you usually want them by turn 2. And if you don't have it, your game changes fastly. I don't know the exact percentages, but for sure, the difference between having your ramp and not having your ramp will make a major difference on how favored you are in a matchup. Just like aggression, because their removal is fairly similar, they struggle with a lot of shields and durability. They don't have any ways to bypass them whatsoever. Aggression has some in things like we mentioned, like piercing shot. A command has none. So the main way you're going to have to deal with those things to either manually get rid of the shields, or there's a very minor amount of removal in capture, but that is temporary removal. So one of the key things to struggle with as command is going to be shields. Removal requires being ahead on the board. As we mentioned, if you don't have a unit, a lot of your removal in command isn't going to work, so you need to get the board early and you need to hold it. And And lastly, vulnerable to discard. As we mentioned, command has some of the fewest options of drawing cards. So if your opponent is making you discard your cards, you're going to have a bad time. You also have the least amount of good playable smuggles. So if you're out of cards in your hand, you just cannot play. Now, the win condition for command is going to be overpowering your units, overpowering your opponents with bigger units. Fairly self-explanatory. This could go either way. You could outvalue your opponent by just having bigger stuff that they can't deal with. You could play it more like aggression and just hit them really hard with big units before they can do anything. But essentially, your condition is going to be just having bigger stuff and winning through raw stats. Now, of course, last but not least from the main colors, we have cunning. Cunning is a tricky one here because the entire aspect is about being tricky. It's about being cunning, right? So the main keywords are going to be ambush, just like command. You have hidden. Once again, we've spoken about this. Saboteur, to bypass your sentinels and your shields. There's a little bit of shielded in the color, some raid for some stronger damage, and a very big amount of smuggle. Cunning really excels at having so many different ways to play. And your hand is not the only thing your opponent's going to need to worry about. Your resource roll is a second hand for you. And that is one of the strongest points that cunning has in its favor. Now, what does cunning do well? Now, cunning is unpredictable, and that is one of its strongest strengths. It is really hard for your opponent to know what you are going to do. Whether it's the cards listed above here that are just bouncing things back to your hand, or letting you play stuff earlier than you're supposed to, sneak attack, making it so if you're at 6 resources, and your opponent thinks that you cannot play a 7 cost, they need to think again. You can absolutely do that. You have cards like Bamboozle that let you play even though you have no resources open. It's really hard to tell what you're going to do. And even if you don't play from your hand, you have so many options from your resource row, or I mean, depending on the deck, maybe even your discard, making cunning very tricky to play against. Cunning does a lot of tempo-based removal, so this is some of the strongest removal in the game, but it is usually a very temporary aspect. For example, bouncing things back to your hand or exhausting them doesn't really deal with the problem long term. They can just play it back or wait a turn, but it does get rid of the problem right now, and often enough, that's just enough time because you are a very fast aspect, a very aggressive one, really tied with aggression for being the fastest or strongest early game. And having a way to temporarily get rid of a problem is okay if the time that it comes back is no longer a stress for you. Rule bending. Now this is the most interesting thing about cunning, is that you do not play by the rules. If you read the rule book and then you jump into a game with cunning, you're going to be confused because they have things that come in ready when they're not supposed to. You have space units that can hit ground units. You have units that can attack and not take damage back, and so much more. Cunning really excels at just messing with your opponent's head and tricking them, thinking they might think they have it in the bag, and then you just pull something out of your butt and just change the game completely. Now, similar to aggression, they do have a lot of targeted discard or hand disruption. Unlike aggression, you don't have mass discard. Aggression usually gets rid of like 2 cards at a time. Cunning is more targeted. Things like Spark of Rebellion or Bazine, you get to look at their hand and choose what you don't want to deal with. So it's a bit less focus on discard, but more about like, hey, I don't want you to play this turn. And that is a very strong effect. Burst damage. Some of the strongest burst in the game is going to be in cunning. Things like Surprise Strike dealing an extra 3 out of nowhere, or Han Solo coming in not only as a pilot, but also immediately attacking. I know Hotshot Blaster is red here, guys, but smuggling cost is cunning. So while it is a red card, it is mostly played in yellow decks. It just goes to show the sheer amount of ways to do some action compression, essentially doing 2 actions in one. You're not only dealing extra damage, but you're also getting an attack out of the way. So if you have a 5 power unit and you surprise strike, you just did 8 out of nowhere when your opponent wasn't expecting it. Now, what does cunning do poorly? Apologies, that says aggression. That's because I don't know how to read. They have no significant late game. And essentially what that means is that while they have some of the best early game, fastest units, trickiest removal, there's not much in Cunning's late game arsenal that can handle long-term games. If you have not beaten your opponent by turn 6 or 7, it's very difficult for you to stay in the game. Most of your 7-cost units are there to help you win back the board immediately, and then if your opponent drops a giant unit like an Avenger or a Devastator, you don't have a way to deal with it. What kind of removal do you have? You just bounce it back to their hand. Well, they're just going to play it again. Most of the removal is temporary. It kind of goes hand in hand. You cannot drag the game long. You need to get in, do the damage you can as fast as you can before your opponent can restabilize. No access to healing, similar to aggression here. There might be a couple of small cards that will do it for you, but not in a significant way. It plays very similarly to aggression, where you need to win as fast as possible. And of course, hard to regain the board once lost. A lot of your removal is tempo-based. Same goes for your units. So if you lose the board early on, you're going to struggle significantly getting it back. You could rely a little bit on your ambush units for sure, but most of the time it's not enough. Now, your win condition is going to be out-tempo your opponent. That doesn't always mean dealing a bunch of damage to your opponent's base right away. Sometimes you're going to simply use your tempo, your removal, to build a big enough board where your opponent just can't deal with it fast enough. And at that point, when you have a big enough board, you can just one-shot them using all of your bursts and stuff. So essentially, you need to manipulate the resources, so even though it's temporary, the advantage is in your favor. We can take a quick look here at the other two aspects. Of course, villainy and heroism. Almost every single deck is going to have access to one or the other. They don't seem to have an identity to themselves. Instead, they modify the identity of other aspects. As we mentioned, for example, in command, heroism has a lot more restore effects or more stall effects, whereas if you look at villainy vigilance, they have the bigger removal units available, or a lot more removal options. So it kind of shifts an aspect's focus. In general, villainy is geared more towards late game, longer dragged out games, whereas heroism focuses on early game shenanigans, whether that's dealing a lot of damage fast or setting up an impenetrable board quickly. But essentially, as it stands, they do not have their own little powers. That said, that's going to be it for all of the aspects, guys. I would love to hear what kind of thoughts or questions you guys have. Do not hesitate. Feel free to message me in the comments. I will answer every single one. And if you enjoyed this, stay tuned. We're going to have the videos about dual aspects coming in, and that's where the real competitive talk happens. That's where you need to figure out how to play your deck to its maximum potential, and that's honestly where a lot of the players make mistakes. And with that said, guys, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you guys next time.